This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and in this episode 965 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by Underdog. Thanks for tuning in. We've made it. This is the last 15 transactions episode of the season. And because of Christmas being right in the middle of the week, this is the last Late Round Podcast episode of the year. Now, as I said at the start of the season, my goal with this show each week wasn't to bat 1,000. That's impossible in this game. Instead, I just kind of wanted to be a week ahead. I wanted to give you insights that your league mates may not have had. Most importantly, though, I just wanted you to learn. This game of fantasy football has tons of variance. Wild stuff is going to happen. But over the long run, you can be a winning player. You don't have to get everything right. You just have to get more right than your league mates, with a little luck along the way. So thank you for another great year. I hope the fact that you're listening to this means that you're fighting for a championship. So let's finish the job. Let's get it done. Now, before getting to the transactions, of course, I have to remind you to check out Underdog. It's the best place to play in fantasy sports. And there are snake draft playoff contests you can join right now for the NFL playoffs for all different entry points. When you sign up, make sure you use promo code LATEROUND for a nice deposit offer. The fantasy football season doesn't have to end after this week. There's plenty more to do over on Underdog. So check it out, underdogfantasy.com, promo code LATEROUND. Now, this last transactions episode always goes quicker than the other ones during the season, because it's just a quick adds and drops episode. But for one last time, let's get to these transactions. Add Trey Benson and Michael Carter. So James Conner was on his way to a monster day before suffering a knee injury in the third quarter against Carolina. I mean, he did have a monster day. It just could have been amazing. Now, the status of that injury is currently unknown. But if he's out, you have to look to the other backs in this Arizona backfield. Now, hypothetically, Trey Benson would be that player if he was healthy. He's been dealing with an ankle injury, so his status is up in the air. If he goes, though, Trey Benson, he's your man. If both Conner and Benson are out in Week 17, though, against the Rams, then Michael Carter is probably your best bet. After James Conner's injury, Carter played almost 3/4 of Arizona's offensive snaps. DJ Dallas was the third down back. Carter wouldn't be an awesome play because of the split backfield, but plenty of waiver wires are pretty thin right now, so he should be added. Add Audric Estime. So the Broncos were without Jaleel McLaughlin in Week 16. That led to Audric Estime seeing a 53% running back rush share. That was his second highest total of the season. He carried the ball 9 times for 48 yards and a touchdown. Now, Andrew Mason, who covers the Broncos, he asked Sean Payton if Estime earned more work after that game. And this is what Payton responded with, quote, "Yeah, I think he has. I think he played well. I was encouraged with the physicality he ran with, and I think they'll only get better, so I was encouraged." The Broncos get the Bengals this week. Cincinnati's a top 10 matchup for running backs by adjusted points allowed. And Denver has an early implied team total that's close to 23 points. So Estime could be a sneaky play. Drop Najee Harris. Look, guys, the schedule got to Najee Harris. This is exactly what I was afraid of. He's been brutal over the last 2 weeks. He scored 3.1 and 4.2 PPR points. He didn't see higher than a 50% running back rush share in either game. His target shares have been lower than 5%. The Steelers, of course, have faced 2 tough matchups against Philadelphia and Baltimore. The problem, though, they get Kansas City this week. The Chiefs have been the absolute best team against running backs this year by adjusted points allowed. I think in 10 and 12 team leagues, Najee Harris can probably be dropped. He's more than likely just a touchdown-dependent asset here in Week 17. And really, that's been the case for the majority of the 2024 season. Add Chig Okonkwo. So over the last 2 weeks, the Titans have faced the Bengals and the Colts. The Bengals are the second best matchup for tight ends by adjusted points allowed. The Colts, they're the absolute best matchup. Okonkwo has seen target shares of 27% and 33% in those 2 games. He scored 33 PPR points. He scored double-digit PPR points 3 times this year. 2 of those 3 instances have come over the last 2 weeks. Now you might be hearing that and you're thinking, oh, he's just going to regress. Well, here's the thing. Tennessee gets Jacksonville this week. They rank as the 7th best opponent for tight ends this year by adjusted points allowed. So Chigakonkwo is a strong streamer once again. Hold Marvin Harrison Jr. So look, I talked about this on last week's mailbag episode. It's been a tough year for Marvin Harrison Jr. And again in week 16, he underperformed. It was a decent enough matchup too. He scored 7.9 PPR points. Harrison has now failed to reach double-digit PPR points in 4 of his last 5 games. You might be ready to drop him, but I wouldn't drop Harrison Jr. Because this past week, he had a 27.6% target share against the Panthers. He gets the Rams this week, and the Rams have struggled a little bit against perimeter wide receivers this year. In fact, Marvin Harrison Jr.'s best game of the season came back in week 2 against this Rams defense. So even if he can't find your lineup, I wouldn't want my opponent to have access to Marvin Harrison Jr. because he is capable of having some spiked weeks. Add Jalen McMillan. Look, it's the last 15 transactions episode of the season. I gotta talk about Jalen McMillan because he is on a heater. He's averaging over 19 PPR points over his last 3. He's had target shares during this time of 25%, 23%, and 16%. Now, he's definitely had some touchdown luck, but it does seem like things have clicked a little bit. Week 17, he gets Carolina. The Panthers have been far worse against running backs than wide receivers this year, but McMillan's seeing solid enough volume and he's playing well, so he might find your lineup this week. Add Bryce Young. So in that same Panthers-Buccaneers game as Bryce Young, he's been playing much better over the last month and a half of the season. He's averaging 18.8 standard fantasy points over his last 4, and most importantly for fantasy purposes, he's running the ball a lot more. He's averaged almost 30 rushing yards per game over his last 6. Tampa Bay is the second best matchup for quarterbacks this season by adjusted points allowed, and the Panthers, they have an early team total over 20 points. That's not always a given for them. So I think Young is probably the top streamer of the week. Drop Michael Pittman. Guys, the Indianapolis Colts in week 16, they had 11 pass attempts. 11. I'm not sure you can trust any pass catcher on this team. Yes, they're capable of making big plays. We saw that with Josh Downs last week. But they get the Giants this week, and they're 7.5-point road favorites. New York's actually been a bottom 5 matchup for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed. And that's partially due to game script. But that's also the problem here. You think the Colts are going to throw the ball a lot if they're leading in this game against the Giants? Now, Michael Pittman, I'm giving him a shout in particular because he's rostered in 72% of Yahoo leagues, despite scoring double-digit PPR points in 1 of his last 8. Unless you're in a really deep format, his ceiling just isn't high enough. At least, his predictable ceiling is not high enough. I don't know why we would feel great about Pittman in this matchup. And really, you could say the same about most of the Colts pass catchers. Add Hollywood Brown. So I talked about Marquise Brown a couple of weeks ago, or Hollywood, whatever he goes by now. I talked about him a couple of weeks ago. It was more of a stash. But we saw him get decent enough usage in week 16. He finished the day against the Texans with an impressive 19.5% target share. And I say that's impressive because he only ran a route on 33% of Kansas City's dropbacks, meaning his targets per route run rate was 53%. That's not sustainable, but it does show intent. The Chiefs are trying to get him some reps. Maybe you can't feel great about him against Pittsburgh this week, but we know there's some big playability there. You may want to at least block your opponent by adding Brown. Add Malik Washington. So I talked about Malik Washington last week. Maybe you already added him. He didn't have a big game against San Francisco. But there's some good news here. He saw his highest route share of the season at 89%. And they get Cleveland this week. On paper, Cleveland's a much better matchup for wide receivers than San Francisco is. Cleveland's the 5th best matchup by adjusted points allowed. San Francisco is actually the 32nd best. They're the worst matchup in the league. So if Jalen Waddle misses time again this week, which is why Malik Washington got a little bit more run, I think Washington should give us better production. Add Rashad Bateman. Rashad Bateman's consistently over that 80% route share mark, and he has multiple 20-plus PPR point performances this year. He was injured this past week, but he still found a way to get in the end zone. In Week 17, Baltimore gets Houston. The Texans have been the 7th best matchup for wide receivers this year by adjusted points allowed. So hopefully Bateman's foot's feeling a little bit better, because if he gets his typical 15 to 20% target share, he should see some production. Add Drake May. Now, I won't lie, streaming quarterbacks, pretty difficult here in Week 17. Like I said before, I think Bryce Young is probably the top streamer. But you could look at Drake May too. The Patriots get the Chargers, and LA's been a slightly below average team for quarterbacks this year by adjusted points allowed. But in similarly ranked matchups against the Cardinals and Bills over the last 2 weeks, Drake May scored 17.5 and 17.4 standard fantasy points. And that's largely due to the fact that May can produce on the ground. He'll add 3.5 to 4 points per game with his rushing yardage alone. I do have some fear here that this game is just going to be this methodical, run-heavy matchup. That may limit fantasy production, but there aren't many strong streaming options this week. That's why May is getting a shout. Add the Indianapolis Colts defense. So if the Colts weren't picked up in your league last week, they should be this week because they get the Giants. And even though we don't know what's happening under center for New York this week, we should still feel good about this Indianapolis defense. They're more than a touchdown favorite on the road, and the Giants have surrendered a top 10 defensive performance in 9 of their last 11 games. Add the Miami Dolphins defense. So just like the Giants, we don't know who's going to be the quarterback for the Browns this week. Kevin Stefanski's hopeful that Dorian Thompson-Robinson can start despite a calf injury, but even if it's Jameis Winston, the Miami defense is still in a good spot. The Dolphins are 6.5-point favorites, and Cleveland has given up a top 2 performance to an opposing defense in 4 straight games. So Miami's defense definitely works. Add the Los Angeles Chargers defense. So my initial list of transactions this week did have Seattle in this spot. And then I realized that LA is rostered in just 44% of Yahoo leagues. So I pivoted. While I do think that Drake May is an okay deep sleeper at quarterback this week, I still recognize the Patriots have done a really bad job at protecting him this year. They've given up the highest pressure rate in the league, and that's resulted in an average of 3 sacks allowed per game over the last 5. New England's also been pretty bad at turning the ball over. They've given it up 10 times during this 5-game time frame. With the Chargers sitting as 5.5-point road favorites, they make plenty of sense this week. So, of course, there's a bonus transaction this week. It's to add Dontavian Wicks. Christian Watson hurt his knee on Monday night against the Saints. His status for Week 17 is totally up in the air. That means that Dontavian Wicks has a real shot to step up during championship week. The last time Watson missed a game, Wicks didn't really come through in the production end, but he had a 25% target share and his route share was 83%. That's a big deal because the Packers get Minnesota this week. The Vikings are the best matchup for wide receivers by adjusted points allowed, the most advantageous matchup. So Wicks needs to be added this week, even if you're just blocking your opponent. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Late Round QB. I also want to say that I know a lot of you drop off once the offseason hits, but I think my best work is done during the offseason, truly. We've got prospecting work coming up. I'm going to be doing shows on what went right and what went wrong during the fantasy season. I'm going to do a ton of studies. Basically, what I'm saying here is if you're into fantasy football, don't leave. There's so much fantasy football content to be made over the next handful of months. And it's content that'll definitely help you out during the 2025 fantasy season. But thanks for listening, everyone. I truly have the best job in the world, and it's all thanks to you, genuinely. I hope you have an awesome holiday season, and I'll catch you in 2025.